Hi, listeners, and those of you that maybe you want to create your own podcast. I need to tell you about a platform that I use, and one of my favorite podcasts, Be the Bridge with Latasha Morrison, uses is Anchor. Anchor FM is free, totally free. It's a creation tool that allows you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. And then it does the heavy lifting for you. You can distribute your podcast so you can be heard on places like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So, if you're interested in making your own podcast, I highly encourage you to download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. It's the way I did it. It's the way that Latasha Morrison with Build the Bridge did it. And it's the way many of the podcasts that I listen to do it. Go to anchor.fm. You won't regret it.
Welcome. You're listening to the Bulldog Educator podcast, hosted by yours truly, Kirsten Wilson. Thank you so much for listening. Music created for the Bulldog Educator is by David Galvez. Podcast platform is through anchor.fm. Welcome to the Bulldog Educator podcast with your host, Kirsten Wilson. This is episode 17, season 1. Today, we're going to be discussing UDL principles and rubrics for support of UDL. I want to welcome back to the Bulldog Educator, Rainbow Bagsby. The last episode, you got to interview me, but this time I'm interviewing you. How does that feel?
Let me just say I'm really excited to be here. It's a little bit different. It's a new skill, but I'm enjoying it.
You know what? And much like you're learning a new skill, rubrics help us to scaffold students into a new skill. So let's get started on all this rubric talk. First question. What are we going to be talking about today in regards to rubrics and UDL?
Good question, Kirsten. I will be discussing how the utilization of quality rubrics supports universal design for learning guidelines by providing options for student self-assessment, self-regulation, and executive functions. It has been proven through evidence-based research that when applying rubrics effectively, lead learners demonstrate increased motivation and authenticity. They are able to find deeper relevance in subject matter when they are provided with a choice as to how to demonstrate their learning.
That is so true, Rainbow. Can we dive into this a bit? This is at the very forefront to the multiple means of engagement in the area of access. Are you saying that when we utilize rubrics, we increase the likelihood of learners finding interest in their learning and diminishing the possibility of them dismissing the learning because of rubrics?
Yes, this adds to the relevance, value, and authenticity a learner needs while providing choice and honoring their autonomy.
Very good. You also mentioned the utilization of quality rubrics. Let me emphasize quality there. Can you expand on or describe for us what a quality rubric would be?
A quality rubric consists of information that the learner can access before and after demonstrating learning. This information can help a learner prepare for the demonstration of learning, and it can also be used as feedback once the lead learner evaluates what the learner has submitted. A quality rubric can promote expectations and beliefs that optimize motivation. It's important that a rubric include criterion for grading. The criterion will detail what factors learners will be evaluated on. Criterion for grading should be directly linked to the learning objectives. Rubrics will also include levels of mastery, also known as ratings. Levels of mastery lets learners know potentially how well they can demonstrate the learning objectives. Rubrics should also include detailed descriptions of what each criterion looks like for each level of mastery. The last component a rubric should include is a point value for each of the levels of mastery. Some rubrics contain a single point value for each level of mastery of each criterion. Others include grade ranges. Grade ranges do not directly show the point value of each rating. Additional information would need to be provided for learners to understand how the sum of the ranges fall on a percentage scale.
That's some really good information. Can you also explain what you mean when you talk about quality rubrics supporting UDL by providing options for self-regulation and executive functioning skills?
Good question. I'm talking about two separate guidelines of the Universal Design for Learning. Providing options for self-regulation promotes expectations and beliefs that optimize motivation. It facilitates personal coping skills and strategies, and it develops self-assessment and reflection. Providing options for executive functions guides appropriate goal setting, supports planning and strategy development, facilitates managing information and resources, and enhances the capacity to monitor progress. Providing quality rubrics for learners facilitates all of these manners of internalization.
And if I'm not mistaken, this also helps us reach towards that ultimate goal of having the student become an expert learner, knowing how they learn, why they learn, and what is the best way for them to learn. You also mentioned providing student choice. How can you provide students with choices using rubrics?
When I was talking about quality rubrics, I was describing a quality single-point rubric. In order to provide student choice, lead learners will craft and provide more generalized rubrics. The rubric that would be provided for assignments or projects that allow for student choice would allow learners to determine the same learning objectives from a list of options provided. Providing choice in this way will optimize individual choice and autonomy. It also optimizes relevance, value, and authenticity. I would recommend lead learners provide an option of 3 sets for learners to demonstrate their learning and provide a 4th option that can be negotiated between the learner and the lead learner if the learner has an idea for a different product. Options could include a video, a slideshow, or written or auditory responses.
So when you're talking about the lead learner, or we could say in this situation, the teacher, and the learner, which is the student, what you're doing here is that you're providing choice to this student with a generalized rubric. And what you're saying is, don't get so specific with your rubric that it basically pins you in on what the choice could be. Make the rubric general enough that then there's a lot of room for choice when you're providing that choice to students. Is that correct?
Right. So the choice that we're providing is how they submit their assignment. The what doesn't change. The standard doesn't change. The product is what changes.
Okay. That really helps me understand that. I appreciate that. So when you mention limiting it to 3 set options with a fourth option negotiated between the learner and the lead learner, why did you recommend that? That's curious to me.
It has also been shown that you provide too much choice, and it can also be a barrier as the learner may be overwhelmed. Providing 3 options allows for the learner to have a clear set of options. The 4th option is for the learner that wants to be able to go beyond just the choices provided. Meeting with the lead learner makes sure that the learner is on the right path for where they're going to meet the learning that is guided by the rubric.
That kind of reminds me of when I go to the Cheesecake Factory. There's way too many choices, and I sometimes end up picking a piece of cheesecake that I really would not enjoy as if I had a more limited menu. So I can get providing a limited menu helps us be less overwhelmed. So I'm back to what we're talking about. You mentioned a single point rubric. What other kinds of rubrics are there?
Well, there's all kinds of rubrics out there, but for this conversation, I wanted to focus on a foundational rubric just for beginners, so that we can start from the bottom and really be thorough. There's different kinds of rubrics, though. You have proficiency-based rubrics, skills-based rubrics, performance-based rubrics, you name it. There's all kinds of rubrics out there. One way that we can use a proficiency-based rubric is actually to provide choice to the student that allows them to decide what level of proficiency that the lead learner is going to evaluate them on. So if we give the learner 3 different proficiency-based rubric options with 3 different levels, the learner can decide for themselves at what level they're at and how they want to be evaluated.
I really like that. So it sounds like first, if you're going to get started with this whole rubric thing, you go with the single point rubric, get yourself really good and familiar with that. And then it sounds like to me, the next step or level would maybe be looking at your standards and then determining levels of proficiency and providing those rubrics based on those different levels of proficiency, where your students maybe have one product that they're going to do, but they can determine how they're assessed by choosing which rubric you'll use to assess them.
Exactly. One consideration that teachers might want to consider as well when they're choosing what type of rubric they use is actually the goal for their students. What do you want to use? Where do you want your students to be at the end of the course? And so that right there can help you choose what kind of rubric you need to be using.
You know, thinking about the difference between the single point and the proficiency rubric, single point you could use where students have a choice in how they display their learning, and proficiency rubric would be you want them to display their learning in one way, but they have a choice in how it's evaluated. Mm-hmm. And so either way, you're honoring student choice, and then they are also having the ability to self-assess in either situation to determine how they're doing to meet the standard of the rubric.
Right, because with proficiency-based rubrics, it doesn't matter if you have a student at level 1 or level 2. The students are going to be at different proficiency levels in the same class. So it's going to benefit the student and build their confidence by allowing them to choose where they feel most comfortable performing.
I could totally see a kiddo like in a math class that's having to share the process and they don't feel confident in their process, and had a proficiency rubric to evaluate their process, and they chose maybe a less difficult math problem that still demonstrates the proficiency of covering that standard. And they do it well, and then the teacher is able to use that dynamic between that proficiency rubric and what the student product is to give feedback, to encourage the student that next time, instead of doing a level 1 rubric with maybe a little less rigor in their product, level up a little bit, and they've built the confidence instead of coming in with a feeling that I can't do it at all. That gives them the choice, and it gives them the safety nets they need in order to feel confident and perform.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, we're going to end our conversation tonight on rubrics. I really appreciate Rainbow joining us and sharing her expertise on rubrics. Thank you, listeners, for listening to us tonight. And this is Kirsten Wilson signing off with the Bulldog Educator podcast. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Bulldog Educator, hosted by yours truly, Kirsten Wilson. You can find the Bulldog Educator on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram using the handle @thebulldog.edu. That's @thebulldog.edu. You can also find us and content related to education and this podcast on our blog at thebulldog.edu.org.